I had exactly 3 minutes before the extraction team breached the front gates, and my empire became a tomb. My hand, scarred from a decade of holding territory, trembled just enough to make the small pink sticky note flutter like a dying bird. The paper felt lighter than the air in the room, yet it weighed more than the millions in gold stacked beneath it. Around me, the study hummed with the silent, heavy frequency of old money, hand-rubbed mahogany, the scent of expensive bourbon, and the ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. Outside, the city of Seattle wept against the reinforced windows, rain lashing at the glass in a frantic rhythm. But in here, everything was cold. A dry, sterile cold that seeped from the open steel of the floor safe. I stared into the illuminated gut of the vault like I was looking into my own grave. The handgun sat on the top shelf, its matte black finish absorbing the light, right next to the wooden crucifix my mother had pressed into my hands before I became a monster. Below them, neat stacks of $100 bills were piled high, the blood-soaked foundation of the Noxon legacy. Then there was the note. The handwriting was a mess of looping, childlike cursive, the ink still fresh enough to smudge. It sat where my ledger should have been. I didn't need to read it again to feel the blade of it between my ribs. I felt a presence behind me before I heard it. I didn't reach for the Glock. I didn't turn with the predator's instinct that had kept me alive for 40 years. I just stood there, my neck tattoos itching under the collar of my silk shirt, as the shadow of a small girl in striped pajamas stretched across the Persian rug. Lumi was standing by the heavy oak doors, her face a mask of somber, terrifying calm. She didn't look like a 9-year-old girl caught out of bed. She looked like a judge. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, tracked the note in my hand. 20 minutes ago, I thought my only enemy was the syndicate at my gates. I was wrong. The real threat was already inside the vault. She hadn't taken the money, she hadn't taken the gun. She had taken the only thing I couldn't replace, my lie that she was safe. The safe door stood agape, its heavy bolts useless against a child with a pink pen and a broken heart. The steel felt impossibly cold. Viral stood frozen, the pink sticky note still clutched between fingers that had never known a tremor until tonight. The floor safe, the iron heart of his empire, gaped open like a fresh wound, its internal light spilling a clinical white glow across his polished shoes. He didn't need to look at the stacks of cash or the cold weight of the handgun to know the inventory was wrong. The air in the study, usually thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and old wood, now felt thin and metallic. His eyes drifted to the polished interior of the heavy steel door, which acted as a dark, distorted mirror. In that reflection, his own neck tattoos looked like jagged cracks in his skin. But it was the shape behind him that made his blood turn to ice. Soft, blue-striped flannel moved in the periphery of the steel's reflection. It wasn't the movement of a shadow or a ghost. It was the steady, deliberate stance of his 9-year-old daughter, Lumi. She wasn't tucked under her silk sheets 3 floors up, and she wasn't hiding in the closet from the monster she knew lived in her father's walls. She was standing right there, watching him discover her intrusion with a somber, mysterious face that looked decades older than it should. Viral's thumb brushed the edge of the note again, the paper feeling impossibly fragile against his calloused skin. He had spent millions on biometric scanners and reinforced glass to keep the world out, yet a girl in pajamas had bypassed it all with a simple truth. He finally turned, the movement slow and heavy, his silk shirt whispering against his shoulders. Lumi didn't flinch. She stood by the mahogany doors, her small frame framed by the opulence he had used to cage her. "You weren't supposed to find that until morning," she said, her voice a terrifyingly calm thread in the silent room. Viral looked from the safe, filled with the gun that built his empire, and the crucifix he had long ago ignored, back to his daughter. The seal on his life hadn't just been broken, it had been dismantled. He realized then that she hadn't been waiting to be caught. She had been waiting for him to finally see the man he was, through her eyes. The clock on the mantel ticked, a predatory rhythm that reminded him the extraction team was coming, but the real war was already being lost right here on the Persian rug. Viral left the study, the pink note still burning a hole in his palm as he climbed the sweeping marble staircase. The house felt different now, the silence no longer peaceful, but predatory, echoing with the realization that his daughter was a stranger in her own home. He reached Lumi's suite and pushed the heavy oak doors open, expecting to find the cluttered sanctuary of a 9-year-old girl. Instead, he walked into a showroom. The room was a masterpiece of curated childhood, filled with every luxury his blood-soaked money could provide. There were hand-carved rocking horses from Italy, shelves of first-edition storybooks with spines that had never been cracked, and a wardrobe full of designer lace that Lumi had always worn with a polite, vacant smile. He moved toward her desk, his eyes searching for a drawing, a stray candy wrapper, or a messy scrawl, anything that belonged to her. There was nothing. He opened a drawer, finding only rows of organized ribbons and expensive stationery, all untouched. It was a room designed for a daughter he had imagined, not the one who had just stood in his study with a judge's eyes. He realized then that he had spent years buying her things to fill the space where his presence should have been, creating a gilded cage so perfect she had been forced to leave her soul outside of it. He looked at a porcelain doll on the nightstand, its glass eyes reflecting his own tattooed face, and felt a wave of nauseating clarity. He knew the exact caliber of every rival's weapon and the shipping routes of every illicit cargo, but he didn't know his daughter's favorite color or what she dreamt about when the house went quiet. The house was silent, not because it was safe, but because it was empty. Lumi had spent years living like a ghost in his museum, and as the wind howled against the bedroom windows, Viral understood that the note in the safe wasn't a threat, it was a final notice. He wasn't just losing a daughter to the streets or his enemies, he had lost her to the very walls he built to protect her. The pink note didn't contain a threat. It contained a set of coordinates that felt like a punch to the solar plexus. Viral didn't need a GPS to find the location. The numbers were etched into his memory alongside the scars on his knuckles. He drove through the rain-slicked streets of the city, his black sedan carving through the dark like a predatory shark. He left the reinforced gates of his estate and the safety of his territory behind, heading toward the district where the skyscrapers gave way to crumbling brick and the neon flickered with a dying buzz. He pulled up to a narrow tenement building on a street the city had forgotten. This was the place where it had started and where it had ended. He stepped out of the car, the rain instantly soaking through his silk shirt, turning his neck tattoos into a blurred ink smear against his skin. This was the address where he had made the choice to trade his soul for a seat at the table, the night he had prioritized a shipment of heroin over the woman who carried his name. He walked up the sagging stairs, each creak of the wood sounding like a whispered accusation from the past. The door to the rooftop was propped open by a rusted brick. When he stepped out into the wind, he saw her. Lumi was standing at the very edge of the gravel-covered roof, her small, striped pajamas fluttering in the gale like a white flag of surrender. She wasn't looking at the skyline. She was looking down at the patch of cracked asphalt 5 stories below where her mother's body had been found 10 years ago. Viral stopped. The air caught in his lungs. The somber, mysterious face he had seen in the study was gone, replaced by a hollow grief that made her look like a porcelain doll left out in the storm. She didn't turn around when he approached, her voice barely audible over the howl of the Seattle wind. "She didn't fall because of the syndicate, did she?" Lumi asked, her eyes fixed on the pavement below. "She fell because you weren't there to catch her. You were too busy locking the safe." Viral stood 3 feet behind her, the most powerful man in the city feeling utterly powerless. He realized then that Lumi hadn't just breached his safe to find his money, she had breached it to find the truth he had buried beneath the stacks of cash and the matte black handguns. He was standing on the site of his original sin, watching his daughter confront the ghost of the woman he had failed to protect. In the cold rain, the life he had built felt like nothing more than a pile of wet ash. He had spent a decade building a fortress to keep her safe, only to find that the person she needed protection from was the man standing in his shoes. Viral reached out, his hand hovering inches from Lumi's rain-drenched shoulder, but he froze when a red laser dot bloomed like a digital carnation against the gray brick of the chimney stack. The world shifted in an instant from a ghost story to a hunt. He didn't look for the shooter, he looked at his daughter, realizing with a jolt of pure terror that the very things that made him a king, the tattoos crawling up his neck, the expensive black sedan idling below, the reputation for ruthlessness, were now nothing but a high-visibility beacon for the men who wanted him dead. "Get down!" he roared, lunging forward to sweep Lumi off her feet just as a high-velocity round shattered the gravel where she had been standing. He tucked her small, shivering frame against his chest, shielding her with a body that felt suddenly, desperately mortal. Below them, the wet screech of tires echoed through the alley. Black SUVs, the trademark of the rival syndicate's cleaners, were boxing in his car. In the gilded halls of his estate, Viral Noxon was a god. Here, on a crumbling rooftop in the middle of a storm, he was just a target with a child to carry. The tattoos on his hands, usually symbols of his rank and the blood he had spilled to earn it, felt like glowing neon signs pointing the way for his executioners. He scrambled toward the rooftop access door, his boots slipping on the slick gravel. Every shadow in the surrounding buildings seemed to sharpen into a threat, and every window was a potential sniper's nest. He had spent years convinced that his power was a wall that would keep Lumi safe, but as another bullet hissed through the air and embedded itself in the doorframe, he understood the brutal math of his life. His power didn't protect her, it only raised the stakes of her death. "Daddy, they're coming!" Lumi whispered into his neck, her voice devoid of fear, filled only with a terrible, hollow certainty. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just gripped her tighter, feeling the frantic beat of her heart against his own. For the first time in 20 years, Viral Noxon wasn't thinking about a counterattack or territory or pride. He was thinking about the exit strategy for a man who had nowhere left to run. He plunged into the dark stairwell, the heavy door slamming shut behind them, leaving the ghosts of the past to face the killers of the present. They crouched in the suffocating dark of the tenement's third-floor landing, the air thick with the smell of damp plaster and decades of neglect. Outside, the rhythmic thud of car doors and the muffled bark of orders confirmed the cleaners were moving into the building. Viral watched the sliver of light beneath the stairwell door, his pulse a frantic drum against his ribs. Lumi sat tucked under his arm, her small hand clutching the wooden crucifix she had pulled from the safe, the one item he had assumed was a mere sentimental relic of his wife's discarded faith. As the beam of a flashlight swept across the hallway outside, the light caught the edge of the cross. Viral noticed a hairline fracture in the dark wood that shouldn't have been there. He took the object from Lumi's trembling fingers, his thumb catching on a nearly invisible seam. With a sharp click, the top of the cross slid away, revealing a hollowed-out chamber. Tucked inside was a silver micro SD card, its metallic contacts gleaming like a serrated tooth. A cold, different kind of realization washed over him, more piercing than the threat of the gunman below. He looked at Lumi, whose somber face was illuminated by the flickering hall light. She wasn't just a child caught in the crossfire. She was the custodian of a decade-old ghost. "She told me where it was before she died," Lumi whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos rising from the streets. "She said you were too blinded by the gold to see the wood. She wanted it out, Daddy. All of it." Viral stared at the card. It wasn't just evidence, it was his wife's final testament, a ledger of the syndicate's atrocities, the very secrets that would dismantle the empire he had spent his life defending. Lumi hadn't broken into his safe for a souvenir. She had been finishing a mission of justice that had been paused by a 5-story fall 10 years ago. She was the one true threat to the Noxon legacy, not because she hated him, but because she loved the truth more than his protection. The sound of a heavy boot hitting the first-floor door echoed up the stairwell. Viral looked at the gun in his waistband, then at the tiny piece of plastic in his hand. For the first time, he understood that the weapons in his safe were the weights that had drowned his family, and the little girl in the striped pajamas was the only one offering him a way to the surface. She wasn't running away from him. She was running toward the light his wife had died trying to find. Viral's boots splashed through the oil-slicked puddles of the city's edge, his lungs burning with the effort of the chase. The neon sign of the bus station flickered overhead, casting a sickly green pallor over the commuters who huddled under the leaking overhang. He moved through the crowd like a wounded predator, his neck tattoos standing out against his pale, rain-drenched skin. He found her, sitting on a rusted metal bench at the far end of the terminal, her small frame swallowed by the oversized shadows of the industrial station. He didn't call out. He simply stood before her, his chest heaving, the water dripping from the hem of his expensive coat onto the grimy concrete. He reached out, his hand trembling with the desperate urge to pull her into a hug, to feel the heartbeat of the only thing he had left in a world he had burned to the ground. But Lumi didn't move toward him. She didn't seek the warmth of the man who had spent a lifetime claiming his violence was a shield for her. Instead, she slowly reached into the pocket of her damp pajama top and produced the small pink sticky note. The ink was blurred by the humidity, but the words were still sharp enough to draw blood. She held it out between them, a paper wall that felt more impenetrable than the steel vault in his study. Viral looked down, the light of the station catching the illegible cursive that had haunted him since he first opened the safe. He finally understood the mystery of her somber, mysterious face. As the rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the corrugated roof above, Lumi's voice cut through the sound of idling engines and distant sirens. "I read it every night, even before I knew the code," she said, her eyes fixed on his with a terrifying adult clarity. "You told me the safe was for the bad men, the ones who wanted to take what was yours. But the gun was always there, and the money was always there, and you were always there." She paused, her fingers tightening on the edge of the note. "The safe wasn't to keep them out, Daddy. It was to keep me in." The confession hung in the air, heavier than the cold Seattle mist. In that moment, the safe haven Viral had tried to build for her was revealed for what it truly was, a gilded cell. He stood silent, the powerful Mafia Boss finally realizing that the bars he had forged to protect his daughter were the very things that had made her a prisoner. The headlights of 3 black SUVs cut through the bus station's haze, their beams sweeping across the grimy tiles like searchlights in a prison yard. The cleaners had found them, and this time there were no locked doors or reinforced windows to hide behind. Viral felt the weight of the heavy duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the cash he had cleared from the safe before fleeing the estate. It was the physical manifestation of every soul he had crushed and every deal he had brokered to build the Noxon name. Lumi looked at the approaching vehicles, then back at her father. Her face remained somber, but her hand gripped his sleeve with a desperate, sudden hope. She wasn't looking for him to pull the gun. She was looking to see if he finally understood the note. Viral looked at the red laser dots dancing across the station walls and realized that as long as he held on to the bag, he was holding on to the target. He stepped out from behind the rusted bench, the rain lashing at his face, and unzipped the bag. Stacks of hundreds, bound in the clinical paper strips of his world, sat waiting. He didn't reach for the handgun tucked into his waistband. Instead, he grabbed a handful of the Empire's foundation and flung it into the air. The wind, howling through the open-air terminal, caught the bills immediately. It was a blizzard of green and white, a chaotic storm of wealth that momentarily blinded the infrared optics of the rival gunmen. As the mercenaries scrambled, their predatory discipline breaking under the sheer sight of so much unsecured cash, Viral threw the entire bag into the center of the terminal. "Take it!" he roared into the storm, his voice cracking with a strange, terrifying liberation. "Take all of it!" He was literally throwing his life away, every drop of blood, every night of fear, and every cent of the legacy he had used to cage his daughter. The rival syndicate members poured out of their cars, no longer assassins but scavengers, diving into the rain-slicked filth to claim the paper that had once made Viral a king. In the confusion of the greed-driven riot, the hierarchy of the city collapsed. Viral didn't look back at the money. He grabbed Lumi's hand, not as a possessor but as a guide, and pulled her toward the shadows of the loading bays. The audit was complete. He was officially bankrupt. His empire was a memory scattered on the wet concrete, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt light enough to run. The chaos of the money scramble had bought them seconds, not minutes. As Viral and Lumi reached the perimeter of the terminal, the scavengers behind them realized the man was worth more than the paper he had scattered. The cleaners regrouped, their heavy boots thumping against the wet pavement as they closed the distance. Ahead lay the only exit, a heavy iron gate leading to the rail yard, secured by a massive, rusted industrial lock that gleamed with a cruel finality under the flickering station lights. Viral shoved Lumi toward the bars, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He could hear the click of safeties being disengaged behind them. He reached into his waistband, drawing the matte black handgun he had kept in his safe for years. It was heavy, cold, and final. He didn't turn to face the men who were coming to claim his head. He didn't seek the glory of a final shootout. Instead, he dropped to one knee, steadying his hand against the cold iron of the gate. "Teddy, come with me!" Lumi pleaded, her small hands gripping the bars, her somber face finally breaking into a mask of pure terror. Viral looked at her, and for the first time, the tattoos on his neck didn't feel like a brand of power, but a memory of a man he was leaving behind. He had one round left in the chamber, the last bit of protection his empire had to offer. If he used it on the men behind him, he might take one down, but they would both be trapped. If he used it on the lock, he would be defenseless. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was the only way to answer the note she had left in the safe. He pressed the muzzle of the gun against the heart of the iron lock. The world narrowed down to the sound of the rain and the frantic beating of his daughter's heart. "The safe was to keep you in, Lumi," he whispered, his voice steady for the first time that night. "This is how I let you out." The muzzle flash was a blinding white strobe in the darkness. The crack of the shot echoed like a thunderclap, and the heavy iron lock shattered, the heavy chain falling to the concrete with a hollow, melodic ring. The gate swung open, pushed by the force of the wind. He didn't wait for a goodbye. He shoved the gate wide and forced Lumi through it toward the waiting maze of the rail yard, where the shadows could swallow her whole. As she vanished into the dark, Viral stood up and turned back to the station. He dropped the empty weapon into a puddle, the water swallowing the steel. He stood alone in the center of the rain-washed terminal, his arms at his sides, his chest open to the men who emerged from the haze. He was no longer a boss, no longer a king. He was just a man, standing in the rain, waiting for the consequences of a life he had finally stopped guarding. 10 years had passed since the iron gates of the rail yard clattered shut, yet the scent of rain on cold pavement still had the power to make Lumi's heart skip a beat. She stood in the sun-drenched kitchen of a small house, miles away from the jagged Seattle skyline. The silence here, a gift she had earned through her mother's courage and her father's disappearance. She was a woman now, her life no longer measured in gilded cages or guarded secrets, but in the quiet choices of a free soul. The morning mail sat on the counter, a mundane pile of bills and flyers that represented the normal life Viral Noxon had once thought impossible. But tucked between a utility statement and a magazine was a plain white envelope with no return address. Lumi felt a familiar phantom chill, a lingering echo of the somber girl in the striped pajamas, as she slid her thumb under the seal. There was no formal letter inside, no long-winded explanation or apology for the blood and the shadows of the past. There was only a small square of paper, its neon hue as vibrant and jarring as it had been the night it sat atop a stack of blood money. It was a pink sticky note. The handwriting wasn't the looping, desperate cursive of a child this time. It was a manuscript, steady, weathered, and finally at peace. Lumi traced the words with a trembling finger, the ink a bridge across a decade of silence. "I'm finally outside. Love, Dad." She walked to the window, looking out past the porch at the vast, unlocked horizon. She didn't know where he was or what name he carried in the world of men, but she knew the audit was finally closed. The man who had confused possession with protection had finally found his way out of the vault. Lumi pressed the note to her chest, a soft smile breaking the mysterious gravity that had defined her face for so long. The safe was gone, the empire was ash, and for the first time in her life, they were both breathing the same free air.